Hi storytellers, and welcome back to the Create a Story You Love YouTube channel. In today's video, I'll be continuing with part 6 of a 7-part video series on 7 steps to nail down your novel before you begin writing. And if you haven't watched the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth videos, I encourage you to go back and watch those videos. In today's video, this will be part 6, and we'll be talking today about brainstorming your villain. You know, how to write out vivid details to get a really clear picture on who this bad guy or gal or opposing force is. And often this will include their backstory, and because you're wanting a clear picture on who it is that's trying to stop the hero from reaching their goal. And at the end of your story, the villain must face off with the hero and lose, at least if you're writing commercial fiction. So maybe there's that caveat there if you're writing commercial fiction. But just a little aside, the ideas I share in this video series are brainstorming techniques that have helped me to write my own novels. But it's important to remember all writers are unique in their own way, and what works for me might not be what works for you. So I want to encourage you to experiment with different methods for brainstorming your story ideas and just come up with a way that really helps you the best to get your stories, figured out. But hopefully some of these tips help you. So that being said, let's dive into who the villain is and why it's important to write down details about the antagonist in your story. So here's a good question to ask. I always ask this when I'm, writing down in my notebook, who is my villain? And then I just start kind of going from there, and I just start writing. Now, often this is the opposing force, either a person, or it could be a larger community of people. It could even be a thing, or even nature itself, that is trying to stop your hero from reaching their goals. Some authors use another word to describe the villain, and they use the word opposing force. I know James Scott Bell, in his book about characters, prefers to call the antagonist the opposition character. He says it's because the opponent does not have to be a villain, just someone with an agenda that's opposed to the lead character. And this is the case in the example of, in the movie The Fugitive, the Deputy U.S. Marshal Sam Garrard. In his case, he has more power, right? Because he has a team of investigators working with him, and he has the resources of the Department of Justice, so he has more power. And that's, you'll find that that's really what makes a good opposing character or villain, that they will have more power in some kind of way. It might be physical, it might be psychological, or positional than your hero. So if your villain or your opposition character does not have more power than your hero or heroine, then the readers will not necessarily worry about the fate or the outcome of your main character. But we kind of want them to worry about them, because that is what's going to keep your readers turning the pages, right? We want them to worry about what's going to happen to the hero or the heroine. And so, how do you give your villain or your opposition character more power? So, that would be in the example of The Fugitive, the U.S. Marshal. He has a team, and he has the Department of Justice at his disposal. So he's just really got more power positionally than the hero. So, that's one example. How do you create a compelling and memorable villain or opposition character for your hero? Popular novelist Dean Koontz says, "The best villains are those that evoke pity and sometimes even genuine sympathy as well as terror." In other words, the best villains are never only pure evil, they are complex and sometimes even charming and able to manipulate. And I'd say that's it seems true, especially in the Marvel movies. Sometimes some of those villains seem charming, right? And so I think that's partly what makes them good villains. What details do you need to create a memorable villain or opposition character? Well, number one, it helps if you can show the reasons that your villain feels justified in what he or she is doing to oppose the hero or heroine. So if, as you're writing, you create a villain in such a way that the reader feels empathy towards the bad guy or gal, then you will have amazing emotions going on in the readers as they read that really compel them to, keep reading. And it's like writing page-turning fiction. And a great way to understand how your villain thinks is to imagine that your villain is placed on trial, and now they have one chance to justify their whole life, and they must appeal to the reader's hearts, minds, and emotions. So that might help. And then just, write down what would they say, what would the villains say if they had to, face a jury, and to try to appeal to readers' hearts and minds and emotions. Number two, your main opposition character or villain needs a backstory. Make your villain a victim of his or her own choices. So as you're brainstorming your villain's backstory, do a deep dive into the first choice and second or third choice that your villain made that began his or her laundry list of corruption or criminal activities. Write down the emotion of it, because it will help you when you begin to write those scenes in your story. And this will tie into their backstory, so this will be really helpful, because then you'll know how they came to be the bad guy that they are today, right? And so that will be helpful. Number three, the best villains are enticing and have some parts of themselves that are compelling. For instance, some villains are very smart, like Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. Some villains have lots of worldly power, like Le Chiffre, played by Mads Mikkelsen in the James Bond movie Casino Royale. So sometimes the best villains are very charming, that they end up being, quite attractive to the readers, so that when they do evil things, the readers are taken off guard by their actions. In a really compelling thriller or mystery, it's the details and power of the villain that makes it into a great novel or movie. When your reader feels like the opposition character or villain has a lot of strength, power, or intellect or something else, and you're also able to make readers empathize with your villain in some way, you will draw your readers in, and this will create a page-turning story. I like what Alexandra Sokoloff's book, Screenwriting Tips for Authors, I like what she says about villains, that they have a lot to do with your story's theme, that they are an entire half of a story's theme. So a story is very often a thematic argument between a hero or a heroine and an antagonist. And at its most basic level, the hero and heroine represent one vision of how to live, and the villain represents the other way how to live. It's like opposing forces, right? Opposing themes. So often the antagonist shows a dark vision of what your hero or heroine could become, or perhaps is on the way to becoming. And it's through battle with the antagonist that the hero or heroine is able to change. For instance, in the original Star Wars trilogy, the hero is in danger of becoming his opponent, Darth Vader, and Luke has to overcome the opponent within himself. As we know from the story, Star Wars, Darth Vader ends up going to the dark side, right? He wasn't always there when we read when we watch the original movie series, of the origins of Darth Vader. We can see that he wasn't always, leaning toward the dark side, but he eventually gets there, right? And so it makes for a very, almost like you can tell how Darth Vader came to be this villain and this evil force. So it's very interesting. There are other kinds of forces of opposition that we see in movies. For example, man versus nature, like we see in the movie Jaws. Man against machine, like we see in the movie The Terminator. Man against monster, like we see in the movie Alien. Man against the system, like we see in the movie The Net, starring Sandra Bullock. Also, there are multiple levels of antagonists in stories. For instance, in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey, the hero, is not only fighting Mr. Potter, but a whole way of life that destroys community and individuality. Another example is the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, where Indiana Jones has to face many antagonists like Belloc, Major Todt, and Colonel Dietrich as individual opponents, but also he has to face the Nazi army in general. So there is opposition on many different fronts in that movie. And there are also non-human villains, like an antagonist that is larger than a human. For example, in the Hunger Games, the villains are Cato or President Snow. However, the whole dystopian society as a whole is really the big antagonist, which Katniss and the Rebellion are up against. I've mostly written villains in romance novels, so I can give you a little bit of that perspective. Some romance novels have more mystery or suspense elements, so those often have obvious external villains. For instance, in the movie The Proposal with Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds, the INS agent is a great external villain who seems to enjoy giving them all sorts of dire warnings for the penalties of faking a marriage, just so that the heroine can stay in the country and not be sent back and deported to her own country. In a softer type of romance, like a sweet or clean or romantic comedy, you might not have a forceful external villain. Instead, perhaps the hero or the heroine's internal opposition are a big part of what's getting in the way of their romance. This will be a key to the big question for romance writers, which usually is, what is keeping the hero and heroine apart? For example, in my first clean billionaire romance, written under a pen name, the hero asks his childhood friend if she would agree to a fake marriage. The reason is he would receive his inheritance from his great-grandfather. And when he offers her $1 million for the fake marriage, the heroine agrees so that she can get the money she needs to pay the bank so her late father's ranch doesn't go under. However, in this story, it's the internal opposition that keeps getting in their way. The hero refuses to fall in love because he was engaged once before to a woman who cheated on him, and the heroine doesn't want to fall in love because she still blames the hero for failing to save her father's life in the truck accident that happened when she was still a child. So the hero is afraid of commitment and has trouble trusting, and the heroine is afraid to trust the hero. So she has her walls up, and which of course by the end of the novel the walls come down, and he has, done what he could to earn her trust. And so she begins to trust him enough to fall in love. And so often in a romance, you'll see that it's sometimes the internal opposition that is like a type of villain in a romance novel. So as you brainstorm this week, here are some tips that I hope help you create a great villain or opposition character. Number 1, write a list of your top 3 favorite novels or movies, and list out who the villain is in each one. Write down details on what you learn about those villains and how those storytellers have handled the problem. Number 2, write the backstory of your villain and different situations or painful moments or abuse that might have led up to the reasons why your villain is the evil guy or gal that they are today. Number 3, write down your villain's special skills or talents. Is he extremely intelligent like Hannibal Lecter, or is she very powerful? Think about what are the special things that they have going for them for your villain, and describe details about your opposition character. Write down real flaws and wounds and fears from the villain's backstory. And then decide if your bad guy is subtle with how they carry out their evil plans, or are they more blatant with the way they hinder your hero's progress. By the end of the story, at the climax, your bad guy must be stopped by your hero. And this is what makes an exciting page-turning novel, is, the momentum between the hero and the villain. throughout your novel. So that's what makes it exciting. So after you've done that, after you've written those all out, you'll be ready for the next video in this series. The next video is part 7, which is coming up next. In the next video, we'll talk about how to brainstorm and write down your story's main foundational elements, including inciting incident, crossing the threshold, midpoint revelation, all is lost moment, and Act 3 aha moment for the hero. So I'll share more about how to brainstorm details of these 5 story beats in the next video. But meanwhile, thanks for joining me today, and I'm excited for you as you begin your journey to write amazing stories. If you've enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please hit the like button below and subscribe so other writers can find this video. Happy writing.